Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to the second channel. We are here again with a few more works to show off from some authors just like you. Sorry, gotta grab my guide here. Alright, before we jump in, some things to keep in mind. I am not a professional reviewer, I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself, just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. So, with that, I think we can just go ahead and get into it. So we're going to start with a book that was submitted by Anastatia Caraballo, I believe is how it's pronounced. This is a book of poetry called Growing Pains. It's a neat cover, well painted if you ask me. Kind of reminds me of like the books I would see in the school library, if I'm being honest. It has a very like classic feel to it. So I've looked at a couple of books on this channel before. With poetry books, I've only done one, so this will be the second one, but as with last time, I'm going to sort of walk you through how I approach poetry books, like in a library or in a store. So I just start with the cover, which looks pretty good to me. I like the greens, like the green text matches the green in the image, and it's kind of a light yellow on the author's name. I'm not sure how well that's actually showing up on the camera, but yeah. I think it looks just fine if you ask me. There's some yellow in the painting as well, so I think it blends well enough. Looking at the back, we see, looks like some quotes from other authors. Let's take a look. Caraballo's words haunt us with their raw vulnerability and authenticity. She brings us into her world, a Boricon woman standing strong against toxic relationships and trauma. With her powerful language and inventive lyricism, she weaves stories we won't easily forget, stories of absent fathers, of struggling matriarchs, of healing, of abuse, and of love, stories in which we see ourselves. The courage of Growing Pains reminds us that sometimes we need to have space to just be, and that despite harsh realities, life is worth living. And that's from Karoska, author of Loving My Salt-Drenched Bones. So that's a good quote to open up on, because like it still gives an indication of what the book is about. Tells us about some of the themes and big ideas that we're going to encounter here. The other quote says, "The ache of grief throbs through this new collection of emerging poet Anastatia Caraballo. Growing Pains unearths compounded trauma as the poet dances with her shadow. There is an element of magic that gives the reader courage and spiritual strength to turn each page. Read this brave collection with an open heart." Awesome. That's from Brenda Vaca, author of Riot of Roses. And then here we have Anastasia, a poet, licensed massage therapist, and a mama bear of 2 curly-haired wildflower children and 2 fur babies. Born in Burbank, California, life has taken her all over the West Coast and Midwest. She has been writing poetry and short stories since age 8 and loves to learn and experience all that life has to offer, including studying abroad, reading tarot, making herbal compresses, and being a self-taught bass guitar noob. Through all of life's adventures, she has digested a plethora of lessons, blessings, and experiences, word vomiting and processing them through the catharsis of writing and therapy. Her work delves into the abyss of mental health, including eating disorders, self-harm, familial strife, grief, purpose, and what it means to be human. Okay, so there you have it. A couple of content warnings there. Not sure if the poems we'll jump into feature any of those intense themes, but just be advised. And then if anybody's interested in this book, it is available at finishinglinepress.com. So I've read the front, or I've looked at the front, I've read the back. It seems interesting, seems, poignant for our times and for many people living in the world today. So now I would just take a look at the first few pages. We have Finishing Line Press. There was a note from the author to me there. I'll skip over it. growing pains. We got acknowledgments and contents. So let's just move into the first poem. Ooh, this is lengthy, okay. But we'll read the whole thing, darn it. So this is called Pobrecita, and there is a content warning for sexual abuse, so please be advised. Pobrecita, the only word mi abuelita is capable of uttering as 3 generations of her diseased, diseased family sit apprehensively in sterile hospital chairs. My nervous forehead is gingerly stroked, timid yet loving, by abuela's weary hand. My mother sits on the other side of me, lacking the warmth my grandma exudes. Coolness pervades the space around her, making the ice pressed between my legs feel even more frigid. Leaning into the security of abuelita's bosom, I attempt to ignore the loudness and chaos of the waiting room. How can these other kids be laughing and so happy right now? It makes me so mad that I can't join them, even if my center wasn't throbbing, blood trickling from too much movement. My body was my last reminder of my age. Everything else was already replaced by helping raise my siblings and taking care of all the chores and cooking with my abuela. Now I don't even feel like a kid anymore. I try to find comfort within Grandma's face. She looks like a different person right now, maybe due to the harsh lighting, or maybe she's as scared as I am. For the first time, her eyes don't convey monumental certainty, and her short stature doesn't command respect. Instead, on this day, that surely must be a terrible dream, her dependable downy clothes take on the stench of fear, worry, and most frightening of all, helplessness. Guilt and responsibility weigh heavily on her defeated shoulders. The abuse was supposed to stop with her. Familial neglect, pain, thieving of innocence was supposed to end with her generation. Instead, destruction, greed, and irresponsible lust have continued to permeate her gene pool. This proud woman who can shut a man up with set lips and a raised brow now sits in her own bewildered silence. This woman who one moment can backhand so quickly at the utter of a curse word, and the next wrap those same disciplinary fingers around mine in silent apology, hums a familiar lullaby in promise to never lay hands on me again. As my mother stands to ask a nurse for another ice pack, I sit cradled so tightly in abuela's arms, as if I am her favorite stuffed animal. Maybe she feels if I never leave her sight again, the world can no longer sink its wicked, gnarled teeth into me, rending flesh and childhood dreams. A doctor calls me into the room to look me over. She is very kind and gentle, but she asks so many questions, I start to feel like I'm the one in trouble. Am I in trouble? How much should I say? He said if I told, they'd never believe me and I'd be taken away. I don't remember, seems the safest response. I know she doesn't believe me, but she removes the pressure from her questions and adds it inside me instead. Telling me to breathe, relax, trying to check my injuries. Focus on the Viewmaster, what's on the reel. I don't want to think about Goofy and Pluto playing and being happy. I don't want to think about her poking and prodding, stretching me to stitch my wounds. I don't want to think. I wish Abuela could be in here, but the doctor says, for my safety, it has to just be me. I am so embarrassed. My flower is supposed to be just for me, not for strangers to see. After an eternity of having the most intimate parts of myself examined, I am ready to find refuge in Abuelita's arms, but her and mother are fighting again, this time in front of a police officer. Everyone's attention is directed to the arguing Boricuan woman, causing a scene as I stand frozen, hoping for comfort. This time I cry, because there is no calm place to turn to. My nose runs, since my feet can't. My insides throb, and I use all the pain, confusion, and anger building up inside as a blanket, a shield, the only thing that seems to care about me. Their backs turned, tempers flared. This is not what I need right now. I need togetherness. I need stability. I need safety. I've never felt so exposed and so invisible at the same time. Pobrecita. Wow. That's powerful. Very heavy, but definitely powerful. A lot of really good showing versus telling in there. Let's go back through it a little bit. I'll stop when I have something I think is worth saying, because, I'll say this, the experience laid out in this poem is so foreign to me. Like, I've only ever, confronted this sort of thing in writing. And so I don't know that I'll have much to say because it's obviously a very personally charged poem. But the word pobrecita, it essentially translates to poor thing in English. And so it's the first word that the poem opens on. The only word my abuelita is capable of uttering as 3 generations of her diseased family sit apprehensively in sterile hospital chairs. I like the word diseased, or rather putting a hyphen in the word diseased, because for one thing, it means diseased, we assume, right? It means there's a sickness that runs through this family. But then also to put a hyphen there, diseased, as in there is no ease among this family. I think that's pretty clever. It's just a little thing, but I like it. My nervous forehead is gingerly stroked, timid yet lovingly, by Abuela's weary hand. Gingerly is a good word. Weary is perhaps a little bit obvious, maybe. But it still gets the point across clearly, My mother sits on the other side of me, lacking the warmth my grandma exudes. Coolness pervades the space around her, making the ice pressed between my legs feel even more frigid. Some pretty good imagery, good juxtaposition too with the warmth of the grandma and the coolness of the mother. Leaning into the security of Abuelita's bosom, I attempt to ignore the loudness and chaos of the waiting room. How can these other kids be laughing and so happy right now? It makes me so mad that I can't join them, even if my center wasn't throbbing, blood trickling from too much movement. So a very visceral image there, and then also some juxtaposition with the laughing, happy children versus the speaker of the poem. So that's shocking, very striking, right? But it gets the point across. My body was my last reminder of my age. Everything else was already replaced by helping raise my siblings and taking care of all the chores and cooking with my abuela. That's a good sentence. I think that says a lot without, directly beating the reader over the head with what you're saying. It is to say, innocence has been lost here. Youth has been lost here. The last remainder of youth, which is tragic. And, obviously the writer doesn't have to say, my innocence is gone. Instead, they say it in this more unique way, which I appreciate. And then on the next line, it says, now I don't even feel like a kid anymore, which may be a little bit on the nose, kind of contrary to what I was saying before. But this poem, I think, is supposed to be blunt, right? And that's the artistic choice that I'm getting here, so understandable. I try to find comfort within Grandma's face. She looks like a different person right now, maybe due to the harsh lighting, or maybe she's as scared as I am. For the first time, her eyes don't convey monumental certainty, and her short stature doesn't command respect. Instead, on this day that surely must be a terrible dream, her dependable downy clothes take on the stench of fear, worry, and most frightening of all, helplessness. I like the mention of Downy because, we've probably all seen Downy commercials that really emphasize how clean it makes your clothes and how nice it probably makes your clothes smell. And so it's a good subversion there where this grandmother is wearing her quote-unquote Downy clothes, and yet it smells because of fear, because of worry, because of helplessness. So I like the choice in Downy there. Guilt and responsibility weigh heavily on her defeated shoulders. There we go. The abuse was supposed to stop with her. Familial neglect, pain, thieving of innocence was supposed to end with her generation. So once again, that's kind of blunt, kind of on the nose, but in a way that's understandable given the subject matter here and given everything the speaker must be feeling, right? This idea of generational trauma and how the world was supposed to be made a better place by people who came before you. Like I said, poignant. That's on the nose in a good way, right? Because I think any person really can sympathize with that. I think no matter what generation you're in, you probably felt a little bit cheated by the generations that came before you. That's just my thought. Instead, destruction, greed, and irresponsible lust have continued to permeate her gene pool. This proud woman who can shut a man up with set lips and raised brow now sits in her own bewildered silence. That's what I'm talking about when I say good, showing versus telling. And you could maybe even take that further by replacing the word silence with just the word bewilderment. I think that's a more interesting descriptor personally. But this phrase, this sentence gives us a good idea of who this grandmother is and what she's acting like right now without actually telling us, oh, the grandma is maybe abrasive, right? It gives us an example through shutting a man up, right? Anyway, and then that kind of makes it hit all the harder when we assume that it was a man who carried out the sexual abuse, right? In theory. This woman who one moment can backhand so quickly at the utter of a curse word and the next wrap those same disciplinary fingers around mine in silent apology hums a familiar lullaby and promise to never lay hands on me again. Okay. So, I suppose there is a way to read this with the grandma being the perpetrator of the sexual abuse. But on my first reading, it seemed to me that, the speaker is the victim, of course, and then the grandma was sort of just incapable of helping her, not necessarily the perpetrator. And even if she's not the perpetrator, it would seem she has, carried out some form of abuse on the speaker, hitting her in response to a swear word, right? As my mother stands to ask a nurse for another ice pack, I sit cradled so tightly in Abuela's arms, as if I am her favorite stuffed animal. Maybe she feels if I never leave her sight again. Oh, sorry, I want to point out her favorite stuffed animal. That's a good simile. It sort of treats the speaker as an object used for comfort, right? When the speaker has just essentially been used in that same way. Maybe not quite the same way, but they've been used as an object by a predator, right? So tragic simile, with a lot of layers, honestly. You could dig into that even further, frankly, because, of what stuffed animals represent for children and for adults, for everyone, and for the use being employed here. Maybe she feels if I never leave her sight again, the world can no longer sink its wicked, gnarled teeth into me, rending flesh and childhood dreams. So again, that suggests that the grandma was not the perpetrator, but someone who simply failed to protect her. A doctor calls me into the room to look me over. She is very kind and gentle, but she asks so many questions I start to feel like I'm the one in trouble. I would just reconsider the words kind and gentle personally. I think those are, again, a little on the nose. And I think there would be a better way to show the nurses, or show the doctor's character rather than just calling her kind and gentle. But I do like how it goes into, she asks so many questions, I start to feel like I'm the one in trouble. That gives a lot of insight into what it's like to be in this position. And then again, am I in trouble? How much should I say? I've said this before, I'll likely say it again. Asking rhetorical questions always feels a little too obvious to me in poetry. It feels like you're guiding your reader to a conclusion a little too, in a manner that's too heavy-handed. But here, the questions actually feel more like, real self-reflection rather than trying to, tell your reader, hey, this is what I want you to think. So here, I think it's passable. It makes sense to me. Am I in trouble? How much should I say? He said if I told, they'd never believe me and I'd be taken away. Tragic, right? I don't remember seems the safest response. I know she doesn't believe me, but she removes the pressure from her questions and adds it inside me instead. That's pretty good. Yeah, it's a good way to phrase that, a unique way to phrase that. Telling me to breathe, relax, trying to check my injuries, focus on the viewmaster, what's on the reel. This was one of the more interesting parts of the poem to me. I don't want to think about Goofy and Pluto playing and being happy. I don't want to think about her poking and prodding, stretching me to stitch my wounds. So just this juxtaposition of the Viewmaster and the Disney characters being seen thereon versus the dark reality of what's actually going on in the real world. Like I said, heavy, right? That's very, very heavy stuff, but it's a good use of juxtaposition, if you ask me. I wish Abuela could be in here. I don't want to think. I wish Abuela could be in here, but the doctor says for my safety it has to just be me. I am so embarrassed. My flower is supposed to just be for me, not for strangers to see. That line sounds like, something that you would tell a child about how to deal with stranger danger, how to, teach them proper sex ed when they're really young, right? And it again just adds to the tragedy of this as it paints the speaker as someone who is really young. After an eternity of having the most intimate parts of myself examined, I am ready to find refuge in Abuelita's arms, but her and mother are fighting again, this time in front of a police officer. Everyone's attention is directed to the arguing Borikuan woman, causing a scene as I stand frozen, hoping for comfort. This time I cry because there is no calm place to turn to. My nose runs since my feet can't. That's pretty good. My insides throb, and I use all of the pain, confusion, and anger building up inside as a blanket, a shield, the only thing that seems to care about me. That's a pretty good metaphor, using these abstract things as a blanket and a shield. I think perhaps it's been done before. My main point is to say it is good, but I think there's a way to reword it so that it comes off as a little more personal or a little more belonging to the author, right? Because like I said, if this has been done before, how do you make it your own, right? My insides throb, and I use all of the pain, confusion, and anger building up inside as I read that. I'm sorry, everybody. Their backs turned, tempers flared. This is not what I need right now. I need togetherness. I need stability. I need safety. I've never felt so exposed and so invisible at the same time. Pobrecita. That's a pretty good paradox, the being exposed versus being invisible. I like that. So, like I said, very heavy stuff. I can't really fully comment on this, just because it does feel far removed from me. But I do feel the tragedy. I feel the sadness. I feel a lot, I think, of what the author was trying to convey. A lot of the mixed feelings of the family dynamic, where on the one hand, it seems like it should be a place of safety, and yet it doesn't feel that way at all. So it is very well written in the sense that, it gave me an emotional reaction. I think the intended emotional reaction, though I can't say that with certainty, right? It's explicit, not just, in terms of subject matter, even though there is obviously some shocking content here. But a lot of it is explicit in what it's trying to convey, where the author, or the speaker rather, at some points tells you exactly what they're feeling, like in this line, I don't want to think. That's pretty clear cut, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of good imagery, a lot of other good devices going on here that aren't so on the nose. Like I said, there's some really good showing versus telling here. A lot of good juxtaposition in this poem, like the kids that are laughing versus the speaker, and the various ways that the grandmother is described as both harsh and loving, or as brave yet incapable in this instance, right? So there is a lot of really good stuff to be had here, even if it is, very upfront with its meaning. So it's not necessarily even the kind of poetry that I kind of like to indulge in. But I can't deny that it's well written. That's my take anyway. So I'm not sure that I would buy this personally. I'm not sure I would read this of my own accord, simply as a matter of personal taste. But I do think it's good. Let's read another one. As with my method of, looking at a poetry book, deciding whether I'll buy it, I turn to the first poem, but then I also turn to a random poem. So let's find a random one. This one's called Inebriated. Is that how you spell that? I always thought there was an H in there. Maybe. I don't know. Let's go ahead and read it. You are dark, melancholy whiskey, robust barrel fire that singes, roars, and scorches your way down my oblivious throat. Unapologetic in every manner, from watering my ignorant eyes to the way you make my tongue swell and choke. Whether reeling me in with promises of mysterious adventure, or the way you leave me emotionally broke, I keep coming back to consume more of you. Just one more drink. Energetically spent, chopped into logs of once sturdy oak. You embody the smoke that comes with a whiskey barrel's age. You slosh over the crooked edge of my glass, leaving me soaked. Seeing me in denial, my trust and tolerance building, you light a blunt, making my flammability a grim joke. Rapid pain sparks from my excruciating realization. You never loved me. You just did not want to die lost, revoked. Depression mixes with your whiskey and seeps through to my bones. My grief is the foul scent of stale smoke that lingers unprovoked. My heart beats past taxed anger, goes directly to bargaining. You say you cannot be with me, for you are far too broken. Maybe I can save you, so you might reconsider an us. Distraught, I know this can't be said before I've even spoken. I've absorbed numerous life lessons to keep you afloat, but your uncertainty, fickleness, is not worth the hangover. Though I initially chose to walk your downcast path with you, your smoke is too smooth. Now I remember why I stay sober. Okay, so on the surface, it seems like a pretty good metaphor for a person acting as whiskey, and why, whiskey is bad for you, or at least bad for the speaker, right? So let's take a little closer look at it. On an initial reading, I think the metaphor sort of loses itself, but let's verify that. You are dark, melancholy whiskey. So up front, clear metaphor. We know what we're working with. Robust barrel fire that singes, roars, and scorches your way down my oblivious throat. Now, I've never had whiskey before, but, I think the thing that pretty much everybody knows about it is that it burns going down. Unapologetic in every manner, from watering my ignorant eyes to the way you make my tongue swell and choke. So I think this is a very effective first stanza, especially in terms of the metaphor, because even though it is describing what whiskey does as you drink it, you could also read this as a description of something else, right? A description of forcefulness, of sexual assault, of an abusive partner, right? There's a lot to unpack there. So that's strong, very strong first stanza. Whether reeling me in with promises of mysterious adventure or the way you leave me emotionally broke, I keep coming back to consume more of you. Just one more drink. Energetically spent, chopped into logs of once sturdy oak. That last line's pretty interesting there. Once again, I think that leaves a lot to unpack about, what this person does to the speaker and what whiskey does to the speaker. The first line going into the second line kind of reminds me of like a father, but I think it is more about a love interest. But reeling me in with promises of mysterious adventure sounds like something a parent would do, right? And getting their kids to go on an adventure. It could also apply to a romantic partner, of course. Then we get this idea of addiction, of course, even though it's bad for you. You embody the smoke that comes with a whiskey barrel's age. You slosh over the crooked edge of my glass, leaving me soaked. Slosh is a pretty good word. Rolls off the tongue with the other S sounds here, like glass and soaked. You could probably build on that alliteration too. Seeing me in denial, my trust and tolerance building. You light a blunt, making my flammability a grim joke. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have much more to say there than what's written, to be honest. The idea that, the speaker's flammable means that they're probably delicate, and the subject doesn't care. Rapid pain sparks from an excruciating realization. You never loved me. You just did not want to die lost, revoked. Okay, so there the metaphor holds up, I think, because, a person might love alcohol, but obviously alcohol doesn't love them back. And that's true for all addictions, right? A person can be addicted to their phone, but, their phone doesn't love them. It doesn't provide them with, a healthy relationship. And the same goes for whiskey in this instance, which is why the metaphor lands, right? Depression mixes with your whiskey and seeps through to my bones. So that's where I think the metaphor kind of becomes deconstructed or kind of breaks down a little bit, because depression mixes with your whiskey, like the whiskey owns whiskey. Just a little confusing to me. If we're still taking it to be the speaker is whiskey, or sorry, the subject is whiskey, then maybe you would want to use a different word there, like just alcohol, because whiskey contains alcohol, right? So it's something that belongs to whiskey. Anyway, maybe this is nitpicking, but moving on. Seeps through to my bones, my grief is the foul scent of stale smoke that lingers unprovoked. I like that line. I like the way that smoke, rhymes with unprovoked. That's good. My heart beats past taxed anger, goes directly to bargaining. You say you cannot be with me, for you are far too broken. Maybe I can save you, so you might reconsider in us. Distraught, I know this can't be said before I've even spoken. That's a very relatable stanza where, we've probably all been in relationships where we want to fix the other person and the other person is just unwilling to be fixed. Or maybe we've been, the one who needs fixing, right? Relationships are complicated. So very relatable, that stanza. I've absorbed numerous life lessons to keep you afloat, but your uncertainty, fickleness is not worth the hangover. So that's a good line too. That also reads as relatable to me in the sense that even when we're with a bad partner, we're learning life lessons from it, but that doesn't make it worth it, right? All difficult relationships have something to take away from them, but that doesn't mean, we put up with them. We ultimately have to do what's best for us, because obviously we can learn life lessons no matter where we're at. And so, of course, we want to be in the safest place possible. And that's pretty much where the poem ends, where it says, though I initially chose to walk your downcast path with you, your smoke is too smooth. Now I remember why I stay sober. And that little tidbit on the last line, your smoke is too smooth, that's interesting. You could probably pull a bit of subtext from that, or rather there is subtext going on there. Why is it a bad thing for the smoke to be smooth, right? That's an intriguing line, I think. So it's hard for me to say which of those two poems I actually thought was better than the other, because they were both very good and rather different from each other, right? This one was a metaphor that carries on for quite a long time, pretty much throughout the whole poem, right? And then the other one was not so metaphorical. It was much more literal, it seemed. So yeah, I honestly can't say which of those I liked more. I thought they were both very good. I will say the first one probably gave me more of an emotional reaction, despite not being as relatable to me. And part of that might be, squarely on the shock value of the subject matter. But I think, if it were just pure shock value with no literary merit, I think the emotional response wouldn't have been as strong. I think it would have simply been, I don't know, a sense of recoiling, perhaps, if that makes any sense. But Anastatia, thank you so much for sending this book in. Some really, really powerful stuff in here. You really clearly laid yourself on the line with this book. You did put yourself into the writing, even if I pointed out, one sort of metaphor that I thought you might have made your own a little bit more. It's clear that this book is a part of you, right? And I applaud you for being so vulnerable, really. It shines through. And thank you again for sending this book in. Might have to take a closer look at this later, see some of the other poems as well. I applaud you for making them long, too. A lot of the modern poetry landscape is just so short. So this clearly took effort, and I applaud that. So thank you again. Really good. Moving on from there, we're going to go to more poetry. This is a very poetry-heavy one, by the way. No short stories, no prose in this video. Sorry about that if that's what you're into. But here we have 3 poems from Felix Baudelaire. I think that's how you pronounce it. If you want to see more of their work, they're on Tumblr at Baudelaire09, Baudelaire09 on Tumblr. And yeah, we're just going to take a closer look at these 3 poems that they submitted. So this first one is called The Loneliness of a Young Girl. When you, a girl, were 12 years old, there was this loneliness inside you, like a bundle of sickness in the pit of your stomach, and everything you touched was infected. There was a best friend who felt like everything, and she felt more perfect than sunshine, because the love we feel at 12 years old feels more important than anything in the world, and the ones we loved were everything. At 12 years old, you are growing into a human casing of skin you don't feel fits you, but everyone else was always perfect because they weren't you. The loneliness wouldn't stop for a moment, and it lingered even when you weren't alone. The loneliness was your only true company, because even as young as 12 years old, you know nothing is more sure than an end. You will never be 12 again, but you will always feel your love sicking you, and make you feel like you're growing again, into a body too small to contain it. You have started to rot from your love. Okay, interesting. Some neat devices working here. So, when you, a girl, were 12 years old, there was this loneliness inside you, like a bundle of sickness in the pit of your stomach, and everything you touched was infected. So, decent metaphor, or simile, like a bundle of sickness in the pit of your stomach, and everything you touched was infected. I think you could take that further, though, write it in an even more unique way, personally. Like, maybe go for some more showing there. Like, what does it look like for everything the subject touches to be infected? What's that like, right? There was a best friend who felt like everything, and she felt more perfect than sunshine because the love we feel at 12 years old feels more important than anything in the world, and the ones we loved were everything. So pretty explicit again with the meaning here. More perfect than sunshine is pretty good. Again, I think maybe that could be expanded upon. And I do like this sentiment that the love we feel at 12 years old feels more important than anything in the world. Because, like, how true is that, right? When you're a 12-year-old, you have no idea what the future holds, but, you know, the things and the people that you love, that's real. That feels important. Feels like it's going to last forever, right? So honestly, maybe you might build upon that idea as well. Really hit at that relatability even further. At 12 years old, you are growing into a human casing of skin you don't feel fits you, but everyone else was always perfect because they weren't you. That to me is the strongest stanza in the poem right there, this idea of the human casing of skin you don't feel fits you. What a good way to separate the body from the soul, right? Because describing a body as merely a human casing of skin that doesn't fit you, that makes it so detached from, you know, a literal description of a body. And so that's good poetic writing right there. That's strong poetry, right? To that point, to me, it sounds like, you know, somebody who, you know, was maybe born a woman, but feels that they're actually a man, right? Or, assigned female at birth, but is a man, right? It's a case of a trans subject, right? That's how it reads to me, because most often I think that's sort of where the mind goes when we, you know, read about people who feel that they don't belong in their bodies. Then again, that's not the only interpretation of the reading. Like, I think 12 years old, you know, you're probably starting to go through puberty. You probably feel very uncomfortable in your body, even if you do feel comfortable with your gender expression, right? Or the gender assigned to you at birth. So there are multiple ways I think you can read that, and for the poem's benefit, right? I like that it offers itself to multiple interpretations, right? The loneliness wouldn't stop for a moment. It lingered even when you weren't alone. The loneliness was your only true company, because even as young as 12 years old, you know nothing is more sure than an end. Okay. Once again, this feels more explicit in a way that the previous stanza didn't quite feel, right? The previous stanza I thought lent itself well to interpretation, whereas this next stanza feels a lot more certain in its message. it's not necessarily bad, but once again, I just think there could be some expanding to do there with this personification of loneliness and the idea that 12-year-olds know that ends can be permanent and sure, right? I think there are a lot of good building blocks in this poem that just need a little more attention and a little bit more unraveling, right? The last stanza, though, says, "You will never be 12 again, but you will always feel your love sicken you and make you feel like you're growing again into a body too small to contain it. You have started to rot from your love." So that provides a pretty interesting ending to the poem, I think. It certainly leaves you with something to think about because, if love is so pure, then how is it that it's sickening the subject of this poem? How is it that it makes the subject rot, right? Something to consider, and so I appreciate that for sure. As far as interpretations go, it could just be this idea of like heartbrokenness, right? Like this longing for something or someone you'll never have again, and that does damage to you in your inability to move on, right? And I think we feel that a lot more when we're younger, like because we're not quite so rational when we're 12 years old, and so when we feel loneliness, sometimes we think it might be permanent, right? And I guess even as adults we can feel that way too, which is tough. So some really great concepts, like I said, great building blocks here. There's a relatable quality to this poem for sure. Even me, right? I was never a young girl. I was never a 12-year-old girl. And yet I related with a lot of what the subject of this poem was described as going through, at least based on my own interpretation of it. So some good stuff there. Just build on it a little bit more, and I think it'll become something with wings, right? It'll really take off. This next one is called Angel in Sacrament. My bloodied hands, dirty with intention, dirty with imposed guilt, follow me, shrouded, hiding, smiling, a grin so sharp it tears me in two. When I hear the music of salvation heralded by archangels, Raphael, tears welled, clouding his vision, reaches his hands down towards me, embracing me with true forgiveness. I feel the light of heaven before I plummet to hell. Okay, so starting just from that first line, my bloodied hands, dirty with intention. Second line, dirty with imposed guilt, following me shrouded. With the book just barely, we talked about, making symbols your own, putting a personal spin on them. For example, a fireplace, right? How many writers have used a fireplace as a symbol before? And so since it's something that's so often used, you kind of have to, do something to spice it up a little bit. Doesn't mean you have to subvert it entirely by any means. It just means, how do you put your own voice into that symbol? And so dirty hands, especially bloody hands, that's a pretty common symbol in literature. It always, to me, harkens back to Lady Macbeth, who, she would sleepwalk, she would try to wash her hands. She said, "Out, damned spot," because she felt the guilt from killing the king, right? And it manifested in this dreamed blood on her hands. And so that's simply my suggestion here is, how do you make the symbol of bloodied hands more personal? How do you make it your own, right? Because as it reads right now, it just sort of seems to be operating as one would expect. And it's okay to operate as one would expect, but I encourage you to do so with, even more personal language or enriching or unique language, right? That would just be my advice there. Hiding, smiling, a grin so sharp it tears me in two. When I hear the music of salvation heralded by archangels. Once again, that phrase, tears me in two. I think there's a more unique way to say that, especially in the context of I hear the music of salvation heralded by archangels. Because in concept, this is interesting. Like, why is it so conflicting to hear the singing of angels? That, in theory, that should be a really happy, really positive thing, right? So why does it tear the speaker in two? Build on that a little bit more, dig into that. This next stanza, Raphael, tears welled, clouding his vision. I'll be upfront, I'm not sure which Raphael this is referring to. I assume there is an angel called Raphael, but I cannot for the life of me remember what that angel did in a biblical context, so I apologize for that. I'm sure if I did know which Raphael this was talking about, or, if my what's the word I'm looking for? If my Christian mythology knowledge were more up to date, I'm sure I would understand the use of Raphael a little bit better, because I'm sure that lends a lot to the meaning, right? I don't think Raphael was just picked randomly from all the angels out there available. So I'm sure that adds something, but, I'm just incapable of finding it right now. I'm sorry. Raphael, tears welled, clouding his vision, reaches his hands down towards me, embracing me with true forgiveness. I feel the light of heaven before I plummet to hell. So again, it kind of builds on that idea of the speaker is torn, and, they're so close to heaven, and yet for some reason they end up plummeting to hell. Once again, just pretty much as with the last poem, I think this is a good base, and I think it just needs a little bit more spicy language. Spicy is probably not the word I mean to say. It just needs a little bit more language that engages the senses and the brain a little bit more. Because once again, I'm sure this is something that a lot of people could relate to, not even in a religious context, but like just in a context of morality, right? Like, how do we know what's right? And when we get close to it, is it something we want? Is it something we deserve? Or do we end up, going with the immoral thing, right? Are we good people? Are we bad people? I think that's sort of the root of religious art, is the idea of simply good versus evil and where we align ourselves. At least I think that's the intention with, a lot of it. I think that's what a lot of what Christianity sort of boils down to is, a person's desire to be good, but maybe their difficulty or inability in shaking off evilness. So just build on that conflict a little bit further. Last one. Insatiable hunger deep within. It is vulgar to be so hungry, a prayer I recite to myself, when the aching and gnawing starts to grow unbearably, terribly, creeping as though I don't notice it, but I do, and I swallow it down. It is vulgar to be so gluttonous, yet, after starving for so long, I can't help but feast on the scraps I receive. As I choke them down, I am thankful, I am happy, yet it is never enough to sate my yearning. I reject my vulgarity, I shove it to the back of my mind. I cry, I whine, I salivate, the bell rings, and then I receive, and the cycle repeats. So that to me sort of reads like an eating disorder, right? But let's dig into that a little bit further. And not just eating disorder, but more broadly, returning to bad habits. So it is vulgar to be so hungry, a prayer I recite to myself. So something to consider with that is the speaker, right? They think it's vulgar to be this hungry, but are they right? Right? Are they saying that sincerely? Is the audience supposed to take that as sincere, or are they supposed to take it as more ironic? Let's find out. When the aching and gnawing start to grow unbearably, terribly, creeping as though I don't notice it, but I do. Okay, so subject agreement, subject pronoun agreement. The aching and gnawing start to grow. It should be I don't notice them, right? Or does it refer to something else? If so, it's not super clear in this current draft. But I do, and I swallow it down. So I swallow it down. That's a good phrase because, the poem is about hunger, the title, right? Insatiable hunger deep within. So kind of a funny, almost subversive phrase to say that they swallow the turmoil that they're feeling. It is vulgar to be so gluttonous. So we've taken the first line, it is vulgar to be so hungry, and changed the word with gluttonous, which is a little more visceral, right? Yet after starving for so long, I can't help but feast on the scraps I receive. So again, it sounds like we're almost supposed to take this phrase as ironic, because if the speaker is starving, then how is it vulgar to be feasting, right? We wouldn't judge anyone who's starving for eating a lot. In theory. As I choke them down, I am thankful, I am happy, yet it is never enough to sate my yearning. So I mentioned earlier, is this about an eating disorder? Maybe it's just more about eating addiction or any addiction, right? And if that's the case, then the phrase, "it is vulgar to be so hungry," that should be taken ironically, right? And even though that is one possible interpretation, it's not really the interpretation I might run with, because hunger is like a need, right? It's based on a physical need, which is the need to eat. We all need to eat, right? But mostly addictions aren't based on needs necessarily, right? Like, for example, a drug addict, or somebody who's addicted to smoking cigarettes, right? Nobody needs to smoke a cigarette. That's not a bodily need, right? And like I said, that's not true for all addictions. A person might become addicted to prescription medication, and that medication might be something they need in small doses, right? But again, what I mean to say here is, I think we're supposed to be taking this phrase, "it is vulgar to be so hungry, it is vulgar to be so gluttonous." I think we're supposed to take that ironically, right? Because it's only natural to get hungry, and it's only natural to eat in response to hunger. And so it sounds like the poem is more about shaming something that is supposed to be normal. But let's continue reading to the end just to see. "I reject my vulgarity, I shove it to the back of my mind, I cry, I whine, I salivate, the bell rings, and then I receive, and the cycle repeats." So the bell rings sounds like, soup's on. Somebody rings the bell to let an animal know that dinner is ready or something, right? And I say an animal because that's just the imagery that it brings to mind, and I feel that that's intentional. But yeah, it just kind of feels like the poem is about shame, right? And confronting shame. For example, like, let's say a person is gay, right? And maybe they're Christian, and so they think that being gay is a sin or something, right? Or maybe that's what their parents have told them. And so on the one hand, they feel ashamed, but on the other hand, they can't stop because that's just who they are, right? And they shouldn't have to deny it. And so it is vulgar to be gay, if we were to rewrite that first phrase, right? It is vulgar to be gay. And so obviously we would take that as ironic, because no, it's not vulgar, right? A lot of people have just assigned it vulgarity for, bigoted reasons, for religious reasons, for any arbitrary reason. There's nothing to be ashamed of, right? Similar to how when you're hungry, you eat, and that shouldn't be shameful, right? That's my reading of the poem. Maybe I'm reading too much into this one, but in any case, there is a lot to unpack, and I think you could argue pretty much the opposite of what I'm saying. You could argue that the speaker is being sincere when they say it is vulgar to be so hungry. I think the poem lends itself to that reading, and that's okay. That's okay that it's open to opposite interpretations, because to me, that's one of the fun things about poetry, is being able to read one poem and then pulling different meanings from it, as long as you can support your chosen theme with evidence from the text, right? Which I think I did. Maybe not as much as I could have. Like, let me write an essay about this real quick. But anyway, these are good. That third one was my favorite personally. And yeah, just the one major piece of advice is just to look at some of these symbols, look at some of the word choices, and just delve in a little bit deeper. That's my 2 cents there, but there is a lot of good going on here, I assure you. So once again, that was Felix Baudelaire. They're on Tumblr if you want to check out more of their poetry. Baudelaire 09 on Tumblr. Thank you very much, Felix, for sending these in. Those were super enjoyable. Next up, we have 2 poems from Ujala Rehman. Yep. That's pretty much all I've got. So we got 2 poems here. I think both Felix and Ujala are pretty young poets, so we'll keep that in mind too. I tried to keep that in mind with Felix's just now, but we'll keep that in mind here as well. So this poem is called Temptation. O temptation, sweet lustful temptation, what is a woman beyond temptation? Temptation in our flowery skirts as we go about our day. Temptation in our black robes while we worship and pray. Temptation in our eyes full of dreams and hope. Temptation in our eyes even when they are closed. There is temptation in our aged limps and youthful smiles. Temptation even when we beg and cry. Not obscured by sheets nor drapes. This temptation we cannot escape. O temptation, dark, twisted temptation. What is a woman beyond temptation? Okay, so immediately this strikes me as a poem sort of mocking the idea that, you know, women are quote unquote asking for it when they are assaulted. That's how I read the poem on an initial reading, and so we'll go through it. I'll see if I can support that reading, but just taking it one line at a time. O temptation, sweet lustful temptation, what is a woman beyond temptation? So again, that line reads to me as ironic because obviously a woman is a lot of things and not just one thing broadly across the board, right? And yet the poem plays that as if it were sincere, right? What is a woman beyond temptation? They seem to be asking that question from a place of genuineness. Not the author, just the speaker of the poem, right? I don't think the author actually believes that a woman is pure temptation. I think it's ironic, right? Temptation in our flowery skirts as we go about our day. Temptation in our black robes while we worship and pray. So the flowery skirt line, that reminds me of like school dress codes, right? Where why is it a woman's responsibility to dress a certain way to keep the men around her from being distracted, right? Shouldn't that be the man's responsibility to just not be distracted? So that's how I read that. And then temptation in our black robes while we worship and pray. That sort of reminds me of like the tendency to sexualize religious women, like nuns, right? There's like a, what's that old, really, really old book? It's not the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, right? The Decameron has a ton of stories, or maybe just one story in particular that I'm thinking of, where the maids are super sexualized, right? It's like literally every maid in the church, they're all like crazy for sex, right? And so I don't think that's slowed down since ancient times. I think that's the point that's being made here is that a woman can be sexualized no matter the context, right? Even the purest of women, religious women who cover themselves up like a nun, right? Even they can be sexualized, even they are made out to be temptation, right? When they should be the opposite. That, I think, is the subtext there. Temptation in our eyes, full of dreams and hope. Temptation in our eyes, even when they are closed. So I like that in the sense that like there's no way to win, right? If a woman keeps their eyes open, they're temptation. If a woman keeps their eyes closed, they're temptation, right? And it further builds on this idea of like the women are the perpetrators no matter what, according to, you know, the warped patriarchal view. Because like if a woman was asking for it, it's because she had a wandering eye, right? And even when her eyes are closed, she was still asking for it. Again, this is not me saying this. These are the concepts that I think the poem is trying to undermine. From there it goes on. There is temptation in our aged limps and youthful smiles, temptation even when we beg and cry. So again, with those lines, it is to say, like, no matter how old a woman is, they can still be sexualized, right? Which is just awful. And then temptation even when we beg and cry. Again, awful, but, you know, a lot of men like it when women are weak in a societal sense, in a sexual sense, in a just a marital sense, right? So I think I'm supporting my reading of the text okay here. I think each line is, if it's not, you know, specifically what I'm describing, I think it's pretty close. No. Not obscured by sheets nor drapes, the temptation we cannot escape. So one thing I haven't really pointed out is the rhyme, which is a little, you know, on and off. Let's take a look real quick. So temptation, temptation, woman, temptation. So, you know, temptation does rhyme with temptation. It's an exact rhyme, right? Day and pray rhyme. but skirts and robes don't, but that's okay. You know, it looks like we're operating on an ABCB rhyme scheme, right? Temptation, temptation, day, pray, hope, closed. It's a slant rhyme, but it still carries through, right? Smiles and cry, almost a slant rhyme, and then drapes and escape, again, a rhyme. So we have a shift here after even when their eyes are closed, where the rhymes suddenly turn into couplets rather than A, B, C, B, right? This temptation we cannot escape. Oh, temptation, dark, twisted temptation. What is a woman beyond temptation? So again, I think I laid it out pretty clearly. I think this poem is trying to undermine this patriarchal view of women as objects, women as temptresses, right? I think that view is far too pervasive in the patriarchy in which we live, right? Where women are seen as seducers and succubi, and men are, painted as innocent. And if they did something wrong, it's because the woman enticed them to do wrong, right? I think that's what the poem is saying, or rather, it's again satirizing that idea, because. What are the women actually doing in this poem, right? Nothing. Literally nothing. Like, they're dressed a certain way. They are either closing or opening their eyes. They're young or they're old. Again, these aren't anything. They're blinking, they're dressed. They simply are an age. So they haven't done anything, and yet they're viewed as temptation, right? So that's where the irony kicks in. It's pretty simple, but obviously effective. I went line by line, and there were a lot of thoughts I had, as you could see. So it goes to show, like, a poem, even though I encourage people to try and use unique and personal words and language, it doesn't always have to be that way, because this poem is made up of pretty simple language, right? Pretty simple visuals too, and yet just based on the apparatus of the irony alone, there's a lot to unpack, even despite its simplicity. So I like this. This is good. I don't know that I have much criticism, except maybe, like, it does use the word temptation a lot, right? And again, that's kind of the point. That's the title of the poem, and that's the whole idea that the poem is trying to undermine, is that women are nothing but temptation. But maybe you could, consider adding a couple more words in there. I threw out the words seducer and succubus. Those might spice up this poem a little bit more, but not even necessarily, because I actually do quite like this poem the way it is. So these are my thoughts here, and it gets to the root of something that makes me very angry, as you can see, this idea, that women are always at fault. And obviously, since that's a topic very close to me, I certainly had a reaction to this poem. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. Inferior. Inferior to the hound that roams the street, drooling, licking. Inferior to the jackal chewing on stolen meat. Oh, how sickening. Inferior to the wolf stalking through the night, the entire forest steeped in its fright. In awe of my disgusting inferiority, sit on a throne drenched with my blood and victory. Yet these beasts stay superior to me. Okay, interesting. One thing I want to highlight real quick is the rhyme. So we have A-B, it looks like. We have, street and meat, and then licking and sickening, which, by the way, I like that slant rhyme a lot. Licking, sickening, that's pretty good. I don't think I've heard that one before. And then we move into couplets again with night and fright and inferiority and victory, kind of a slant rhyme. I think it works personally. And so part of that makes me question the choice to put yet on this line rather than having it start the new line. I get that it sort of emphasizes the shift that's about to take place a little bit more, but even still, I might just, move this to the next line so that the rhyme lands a little bit better previously, even if it is a slant rhyme, right? But with the rhyme having been discussed, let's talk about the symbols. So we have a hound that roams the street, drooling, licking. So we get a picture of basically a stray dog, and it sounds like it's a dumb dog if it's drooling and it's licking. And then we have a jackal chewing on stolen meat. Oh, how sickening. So jackals, we think about them a lot in the context of Egyptian mythology. And here it's not far from that, because jackals aren't necessarily evil in Egyptian mythology. They can be, but they're usually associated with the underworld, right? Which is a place a person doesn't want to be. And death on its face seems very malicious. And so over time, jackals kind of evolved into symbols of malicious animals, or maliciousness in general. And I think they're scavengers, right? And so they do steal meat from animals that actually, killed other animals. I might be wrong about that. I'm no zoologist, but I think this is true to what a jackal actually is. Inferior to the wolf stalking through the night, the entire forest steeped in its fright. So that one feels a little dissimilar to the previous two, because it sounds like the wolf might be kind of respectable if the entire forest is steeped in its fright, right? Steeped is a good word, by the way, for what's being described here. I like that. It doesn't sound like as much of a stretch to be inferior to the wolf if it commands this much power over the forest, right? So that's something to consider. In awe of my disgusting inferiority, I question the comma in that sentence. In awe, pause, of my disgusting inferiority. I don't think that comma needs to be there, personally. Sit on a throne drenched with my blood and victory, yet these beasts stay superior to me. So, to me that sounds like basically just any world leader, right, who has blood on their hands, which is most world leaders. And yet, even though they are quote-unquote victorious, right, they are less than animals. And I think that's a little bit poignant right now in this era of turmoil that we're currently living in, where we have a lot of world leaders who do have blood on their hands, and they try to make themselves out to be, the victors, whereas really they're no worse than or no better than a wolf, right? In fact, a wolf, a dog, a jackal, those things kill and eat because they have to. They do it for survival, right? Whereas a human does not need to kill another human for survival, right? They do it out of sheer maliciousness. So, just given the context that we're living in right now, that was sort of my reading of this. It sounds like a criticism of monarchs and other leaders, but Ujala did provide some context, at least to one of the poems, so let's take a look real quick. Hey there, so I believe that the poems that I included need some context to be understood the way I want them to be. Temptation itself is extremely clear, however, inferior needs some background. I wrote inferior when someone told me that men are naturally superior to women. I didn't agree with the sentiment. One of the reasons I didn't is expressed in the poem itself. So armed with that piece of information, I hope you will thoroughly enjoy both poems. Okay, so sounds like patriarchy then is what's actually being deconstructed here. And that kind of almost still applies to my reading, since most world leaders are men. If patriarchy was the point of this poem, I think you could make it clear that this final person sitting on their throne, you could make it clear that they're a man, and maybe that the animals are women. I don't know. Because as it stands, I don't think the internal workings of the poem actually lend themselves to, criticisms on gender. It's a, first of all, terribly stupid thing to say that women are inferior to men, or that men are naturally superior to women. That's the dumbest thing ever, right? But I don't think the poem actually comments on that. I think the first poem, Temptation, does a really good job of deconstructing patriarchy, but this one not quite as much. I don't think there's a lot in the body of this text that lends itself to a reading based on gender. But that's just me. Maybe somebody else read it and thought entirely differently. Maybe they hit the nail right on the head with this idea of men and women and superiority and inferiority between them. So I'd love to hear anyone and everyone's thoughts there. But Ujala, this was cool. I thought both poems were good. I think I had, more criticism for this second one. This first one is I like it a lot, despite its simplicity, because usually, I've said this before, I don't often love poems with simple language or simple rhymes, but I don't know, there's just something to this one. I like it. So, awesome. Really good job. Thank you for submitting those. That's going to bring us into the last one. We got a little short poem here from Johan, and Johan his work is on Instagram at Johan_d.poz. He did want to mention, though, that all of his work is in Italian, and he usually writes in Italian, so this is just the poem he submitted to me was in English. He submitted it as a screenshot, so I transcribed it here as it was written. Naked eye dressed in horror, decaying, the body rots anew, broken every dreaded mirror, free from the chains of symmetry, paints an ephemeral picture of truth over this skin-covered flesh, and flesh-covered bones, and bones-covered soul, a vague look of humanity surfacing once more. Okay, interesting. A couple of things to note right off the bat. I feel like anew and ephemeral are words that I personally have used a lot in poetry, and so I don't know if I'd go as far as to say they're used a lot in poetry. I might, because probably the reason I used them is because I saw them being used a lot, and so I might replace those with something else, something a little more unique. Commenters, if you guys read a lot of poetry, you can either back me up or disagree with me here. Tell me whether anew or ephemeral are words that you guys see a lot in literature. Also, symmetry, that's how it was written in the screenshot. That's not the English spelling. It has a Y instead of an I right here. So just something to note for revision. But let's really get into the meat of the poem now. Naked eye dressed in horror, decaying, the body rots anew. I question the apostrophe. I question saying decaying rather than decaying. We've talked about this before, I think, on this channel, but like in a poem, you tend to want to strive for similitude in your use of language. Decaying sounds like a little too casual compared to the rest of the language in this poem. But let's keep reading. So, naked eye dressed in horror, decaying, the body rots anew, broken every dreaded mirror, free from the chains of symmetry. So, sounds like we're dealing with a speaker who is hideous to look at, or maybe not even a speaker, but the subject, right? Maybe the subject is hideous to look at. They are dressed in horror. They are rotting. They break every dreaded mirror, it sounds like. And why would a mirror be dreaded unless you don't want to look at yourself in it, right? And then free from the chains of symmetry. Normally we associate symmetry with beauty, right? If somebody has a symmetrical face, that makes them pleasant to look at. So again, all these signs just point to the subject being ugly, right? Paints an ephemeral picture of truth. So that's an interesting shift. We have an ugly thing here, it sounds like, and yet they are ephemeral, and they are the picture of truth. Over this skin-colored flesh and flesh-covered bones and bones-covered soul. I would probably say bone-covered soul. I know it doesn't quite track with bones being plural here. You could make it singular, but also I think it just reads a little bit smoother, rolls off the tongue a little bit better. Skin-covered flesh and flesh-covered bones and bone-covered soul. Yeah, I think that reads a little bit more nicely. A vague look of humanity surfacing once more. So it's a little bit cryptic, which I like personally, but it sounds to me like we're commenting on sort of the ugliness of humanity. The ugliness that lies under the surface is what it sounds like to me. Or maybe just the opposite, right? Maybe it's this idea that beauty is inside all of us despite the outer shell. I think you could read it both ways. I think the idea of beauty underneath is a little more strong as it stands. Naked eye dressed in horror, decaying, the body rots anew, broken every dreaded mirror. I also wanted to point out horror and mirror as a slant rhyme. I like that a lot. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but I think it's cool. So So we have this ugly thing, this ugly person, and yet they are an ephemeral picture of truth, because over all of this ugliness, they represent humanity. That's literally what the poem is saying, right? That's me sort of paraphrasing what the poem is saying. So I guess my question as a reader is like, what is the look of humanity surfacing on this individual? It seems a little bit unclear with the current length and body of the poem. Maybe you want to specify a little bit more, because as it stands, the meaning is actually a little bit hard to uncover. Not necessarily, what am I trying to say? Like I said, I like it when poems are cryptic, but this poem just reads as like a little bit unfinished, right? Because the questions that I'm asking myself, they're not necessarily helping me to uncover the meaning. They're just kind of leading me to have more questions, right? And so to me, it just feels like there's kind of something missing from this poem to really crack the egg, to really get to the yolk of what's going on here. But as it stands, my reading of the poem would sort of suggest this idea that humanity maybe is ugly on the outside, but maybe there's goodness lingering within, right? That's simply how I read it as it stands. And that, it looks like, is the last poem for this session. So a little bit shorter than normal. The poems themselves were, well, most of them were a little bit shorter. But I really want to thank everyone who submitted. Anastatia, Felix, Baudelaire, Ujala, Rehman, and Johan. Thank you guys very much for watching me. Let me know in the comments if there's any other context you'd like to add. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But this was a really great batch of poetry. A lot of really different stuff going on with a lot of these, which was cool. It's always good to get like a nice mixture. So thank you guys. And thank all of you who are watching. Much appreciated. And I'll see you guys in the next one.